All right, so before we jump in and start working with components, let's talk about what they actually are. It's very important to understand how components work and how they're structured. So Angular applications have a common structure, and they're made up of a few different entities, including modules, services, and components, which are the bulk of most applications. So when we look at a user interface or any application, we see things like navigation bars, headers, input boxes, and the list goes on. Well, we can think of these pieces of the UI as their own individual components with their own functionality. That's what frameworks like Angular are great for. It really organizes our code and the application itself. So every Angular component includes a class which can have properties and methods or functions attached to it. A method is just a function inside of a class. So components also have templates associated with them, and this is what the user actually sees in the browser. So we can also bind data from the component class to the template and vice versa. This is what makes Angular so dynamic. So here's an example of what a very simple website or application may look like and how we can break things up into components. Now, most Angular applications will have something called a root app component, and then all of the components that we create will be nested inside of that one root component. So if we look at this image here, we have a navbar and a sidebar component, and then we have a post component. And notice that inside the post we have a post search component, and then we have multiple single post components, which would represent the individual post. Okay, so we can nest them and we can pass data to and from them, and you can see this really helps organize not just the functionality in the code, but the actual application itself. So why do we want to do this? Why do we want to use components? It's obviously great for organization, and we've pretty much already established that. It also allows us to break up the user interface so that we can encapsulate functionality with properties and methods of each component. It also promotes reusability. It stops us from having to repeat ourselves, which is a common struggle in programming just in general, not just in Angular. So in addition to reusing components in the same application, we may also be able to reuse them across multiple apps in the future. So breaking things up into components and being more organized really does wonders for working in teams. It makes it easy for other programmers to read your code and know exactly what's going on and what goes where. Angular is used quite a bit in the business world, and that's small business and on the enterprise level. So this really benefits programmers big time. All right, so what I want to do now is just examine the structure of a very, very simple component. This is actually the root app component that's included with the quick start. So if we look at the top here, it says import component from Angular core, and what this is doing is it's bringing in the core component class from the Angular core library. Remember, Angular is made up of a bunch of different libraries, and this is one of them. So once we do that, we can then use the component decorator. So this @ symbol component, this is called a decorator, and it allows us to add metadata to our component. All right, some of the things we can add is the selector. So in this case, it's my-app, and the selector is what's used as the directive to insert the component in the HTML. And then we can also include the template, which in this case is a template string. You can see it actually uses backticks instead of quotes, and this allows us to put HTML on multiple lines. All right, now you can also use, instead of template, you can use template URL, and you can actually point to a separate HTML file rather than putting all your markup here. All right, now this here, this double curly brace, we're going to get into this later, but this is string interpolation. This allows us to insert dynamic data into our template, dynamic strings. Down here we have our class, so it's called app component in this case, and we have a property in that class called name that's equal to the string Angular. Okay, and we're actually binding this name value to this value right here. So this would, in the browser, it would say hello Angular. And then this part down here is where you would insert your component into the HTML. In this case, we have a directive called my-app, and that has to be equal to whatever we chose for the selector right here. Okay, so this would insert hello Angular. Now, as we move through an Angular application, components, they're created, updated, and destroyed. And this process is called a life cycle. And there's specific hooks that we can put into our class to take action at certain moments. For instance, the ng-on-init hook will let us add some functionality when the component initializes or loads. This is the most common hook, but we also have hooks that will fire off when a component changes or gets destroyed. This can be somewhat complicated to understand, and we'll get more into this later, but I did want to mention it now. So if we start to use the Angular CLI and you really understand how a component's structured, how the files are created, and so on, you can use the CLI to actually generate components very easily. So you can just run a simple command like ngg for generate component, and then wherever you want to put it, in this case it's in a folder called components, and then it's actually called my component, and it's going to create a couple different things. It's going to create the TypeScript file, which is the main file, an HTML template, and then a CSS file for that component. And then it's also going to add that component to the ng module decorator, which is located in the app.module.ts file, and we're going to go into that in the next video. Alright, so that's going to be it for now. Before we get in and we start creating components in Angular, I just want to take a look a little closer at ng module and what Angular modules actually are.